Citroën has a long history of large flagship luxury cars, from the traction Avant in the 1930s through the futuristic DS in the 1950s and the technological showpiece that was the SM in the 1970s. The C6 was the last in a long line of these cars. It focused less on new technology, although it had its fair share of that, but like all those other cars, it had an avant-garde style all of its own, something to set it apart from the BMW wannabes of the mid-2000s. But given it was the last large luxury Citroën, you can probably deduce it didn't sell that well. Just why was that, and what relationship does it have with the second generation car that launched in China? This is a Citroën C6 story. Before we get started, just a gentle reminder, I have a podcast with audio versions of old car histories I've already done. In each episode, I also talk a little bit more about the car and its impact, and sometimes update the history, as in the case of the new 5th generation Range Rover that came out since I made the video. I've put links in the description, but for now, let's get on with the C6 story. Citroën's flagship, the XM, launched in 1989. It sold modestly well, so towards the end of the millennium, thoughts naturally turned to a successor. The plan was to launch it by 2000, but work on it started late, no doubt because Citroën's small development team were focusing on rejuvenating their mainstream fleet, which is where the profits lay. By 1998, the rumour went around that the XM wouldn't be replaced at all, or if it was, it would be a stretched version of the Xantia replacement, and it would ditch Citroën's magic carpet-like hydropneumatic suspension for something more dull and ordinary. Some of these rumours were true. Yes, it would use the next generation Xantia platform to save money, but it wasn't going to be dull. Citroën asked various design houses to create a suitably avant-garde shape befitting the historic Citroën brand. There were designs from Italdesign, Bertoni, Heuliez, Design Research Associates, Pininfarina, and from Citroën's own team. All designs were pretty out there for a luxury saloon. Maybe Citroën had one eye on French rival Renault, who were wowing the press and public with their own forward-thinking designs like the Valsatis concept, and in February 1999 would show off their own avant-garde luxury Grand Tourer, the Aventime. Citroën fought back, showing their XM successor, the C6 Lineage concept at the 1999 Geneva Motor Show, which was a version of one of their in-house designs. The XM had been a hatchback, but customers of large luxury cars had roundly rejected that idea, so this concept was a saloon. Like many concept reveals, Citroën were at pains to tell the press that this was just a concept and that they didn't plan on producing it, whilst secretly, of course, harbouring hopes that the press would love it and that they had a hit car on their hands. Thankfully, the press and public liked it. Some had feared the shape would have been bland like some of Citroën's other cars in the 1990s, but the C6 was different, with a stunning interior that for some reason had a small tree growing out of the centre console. The Citroën XM Multimedia a year earlier delivered navigation with voice control and internet on the go, with the Windows 95 PC taking up boot space. They promised the same with the new C6 concept, but in my experience, 2G speeds at the time were pitifully slow and became unusable at highway speeds, so this idea was a non-starter. In the C6 blurb, they focused on the car's smooth ride and elegant luxury, but for some reason they were at pains to point out that both men and women were able to travel in comfort and safety, as if competitors' cars were perfect for men but a living hell for women. This wasn't the first time Citroën had used the C6 name though. In 1929, a 6-cylinder version of the C4 was released as the C6, a luxury car that Citroën hoped would take the fight to Renault. It offered rear occupants their own telephone, or was that a shower? It's not really clear. The C6 name fell in line with Citroën's plan to name the cars from C1 to C8, for some reason missing out the C7 and calling it the C-Crosser, but in any case it was slightly surprising that Citroën decided to call their car the C6, given that the original car was considered a failure, only lasting 3 years in production. One of the many novel design elements of the new C6 were the clamshell doors, a design element used on the original C6 and something only recently reintroduced by US auto brand Saturn on the driver's side of the SC 2 years earlier. Doors that opened this way had fallen out of fashion because of their tendency for the wind to blow them open at high speeds if not properly closed, which is why they were given the name suicide doors. When pushed, Citroën marketers did admit that if the public liked it enough that they would consider limited production, maybe 3,000 cars per year. That seemed a ridiculously low volume for a production car to make any profit, but regardless, the public was keen to see the C6 go into production, and Citroën hoped it would hit showrooms by 2003. That wouldn't be a moment too soon, as the XM ended production in 2000, and that meant Citroën would be without a large car for the first time in decades. The new C6 would use a stretched version of the platform used by the upcoming C5, a platform also used by the new Peugeot 407. Development continued slower than expected though. It took until 2001 for Citroën to choose a final C6 design, one from their in-house team. The car will be offered with just two engines, the 2.9-litre V6 from the Citroën XM expanded a little to 3 litres, and a new 2.7-litre turbo diesel developed in collaboration with Jaguar and Land Rover. Citroën also decided to retain their signature hydropneumatic suspension from the XM to give this luxury car a smooth, luxurious ride that would make it stand out from the competition. Inside, Citroën borrowed as much as they dared from the smaller C5, that is, not much, just the stalks, audio system, heating, window and mirror controls. This was, after all, meant to be something to take on the best luxury cars Europe had to offer, so everything the owner touched had to be premium quality, and most of the bits from the C5 just wouldn't cut it. Standard dials were swapped out for an electronic screen, and an infotainment system sat front and centre with a raft of controls below. The expected 2003 release date came and went. It would take until spring 2005 until the final car was shown, and then the rest of the year until its official launch. At that press event, Citroën went all out. This was their new car to take on luxury brands like BMW, Mercedes and Audi, but also smaller players like Volvo, Saab and their sister brand Peugeot. The big differentiator, of course, was the shape, almost identical to the radical concept 6 years earlier, and the C6 was photographed next to the classic DS to remind people of Citroën's lineage and also which car the C6 was supposed to be channeling. On the outside, the main difference between the concept and the final production car was the lack of the clamshell doors, but that feature wasn't missed. At the rear, it still had the large bulbous boot with rear lights that were visible from the back and side. The rear window was a clever piece of concave glass, like its predecessor the CX. Citroën were at pains to point out the car's pedestrian safety. The bonnet popped up using a pyrotechnic mechanism if it detected the car hit a person, and it was the first car to get a 4-star Euro NCAP rating for pedestrian safety. The press loved the smooth ride on the highway given by the hydropneumatic suspension, like the car was flying through the air. But around town they found it lumpy, another reason why it was really just Citroën clinging on to this type of suspension. Motoring journalists weren't fans of the road noise either, despite Citroën calling out the C6's quiet cabin as one of its star features. And the twin exhaust pipes wrote checks that the engine couldn't cash. Despite the speed-sensitive rear spoiler, this wasn't a car big on performance, but on effortless travel. Inside, Citroën retained the 2 rear seat layout, and both seats could be electronically adjusted. This wasn't a car for a gaggle of kids with child seats. Rear passengers had a useful feature where they could automatically adjust the front passenger seat to give themselves more legroom. But 2 features had been dropped from the concept: internet multimedia connectivity and that center console tree. The plush front seats were also electrically adjustable. The curves on the outside extended inside to the dashboard as well as the doors. The first time on a French car, Citroën offered a heads-up display along with a lane departure warning system, a navigation system and Bluetooth that were beginning to become commonplace. Back in 1999, when the concept appeared, Citroën threw out a low expected sales rate of 3,000 cars per year. Upon launch, that had increased to 20,000 cars per year, a more realistic number that would ensure the car at least made a profit. But for all its beauty, there were problems. Citroën XM customers had moved onto other cars. After all, it ended production almost 6 years earlier. In the UK, the C6 fell in the top 35% company car tax bracket, whereas a BMW 530i was only 30%, and the BMW got better mileage and performance. Then there was a depreciation. On the BMW, it was a known quantity, but Citroën had just launched the cheap and cheerful C1. Yes, the C6 came in cheaper than similarly spec'd German cars, but it might be worth just half its value in a year or two. Better to stay safe and buy a car that holds its value. But if you weren't shelling out for the car, you could still enjoy how it looked. The London Design Museum put the C6 on display as an example of great design. In 2006, the C6's engine lineup expanded to a smaller 2.2 litre four-cylinder diesel shared with Land Rover and Peugeot. In 2008, the manual gearbox was dropped, and maybe realising just how outclassed the petrol engine was, it was dropped in 2009, being replaced by a more powerful 3 litre 240 horsepower diesel. Given the refinement and better fuel economy of diesels, this seemed like a smart move. In 2010, the C6 got a small update, LED daytime running lights and apparently larger mirrors, plus the option of a 3G internet connection. The original C6 in 1929 was a sales flop, but its 60,000 odd sales over 3 years made it look like a hit compared to the new car, which sold only about 23,000 cars before Citroën threw in the towel in 2012. The previous car, the XM, had sold 334,000 cars, and the car before it, the CX, had sold over 1 million. It was a bitter disappointment for the brand and their biggest flop since its takeover by Peugeot in the mid-1970s. When Citroën launched the C6, they produced a marketing document telling the press about the market segment that they were entering. There were 2 types of customers, they said: those who bought German luxury cars and those that didn't. The German buyers were younger, the non-German buyers were older, and many were retired. Citroën felt the C6 appealed to both customers. I'd argue that they appealed to neither. The younger German car crowd wanted excitement, performance, and a badge to show that they'd arrived. The C6 had none of that. Older non-German buyers wanted a more traditional car, but the C6's avant-garde styling made them run for more traditional fare. Citroën said in 2004 the total UK market for this type of car was 158,000 cars. I don't have data for UK sales, but if all C6s had been sold just in the UK, which they most definitely weren't, then Citroën would have taken just over 2% of the market. The dream of the large luxury Citroën was over. Or maybe not. The same year C6 production ended, Citroën presented the Numero 9, or number 9 concept, pitched as a future 4-door luxury car for their newly created DS brand. It would be a plug-in hybrid offering an EV range of 31 miles and delivering 295 horsepower. This car wasn't destined for Europe though. That ship had sailed. It was designed for Chinese customers who were more interested in a large Citroën, and the intention was to build it in China. But despite being another stunning design, it never made it to production. China would get a large Citroën though, and it would also be called the C6, with marketing material that played up the exotic French styling. It launched in 2016 based on the PSA EMP2 platform that was shared with cars like the C4 Picasso and Peugeot 408. There was also a similarity with a larger Peugeot 508, which used an evolution of that platform, but it bore a much closer relationship with a slightly longer Dongfeng A9. Dongfeng was Citroën's Chinese partners. The new C6 might be a more conventional looking car, but it had a stylish interior and dashboard with rear seats that could be heated, cooled, and even massage you. Chinese C6 production ended in 2023 after lackluster sales, but there would be one more luxury saloon from Peugeot Citroën, but not using the Citroën brand. That had been abandoned to the mass market, but the new DS brand was meant to be a little more upmarket. After all, avant-garde was in the brand's tagline. So in 2020, the DS9 launched, apparently the name of a car and not a space station. It was again produced and sold in China, but this time it would be sold in Europe. The shape was much more conventional than both the 2005 C6 and the Numero Neuf concept from 8 years earlier, looking like an Audi A6 with a different badge. It was built on a stretched version of the same platform as the Peugeot 508, and it looked a lot like that car as well. I'm sure Peugeot and Citroën thought DS would start to compete with luxury brands. After all, the fit and finish of a Citroën and a BMW weren't light years apart, so with some higher quality materials inside, what's the difference? Unfortunately, the ride, handling and performance didn't stack up, and so far sales have been on par with previous C6s, that is, not that great. Peugeot Citroën acquired Vauxhall and Opel in 2017, then merged with Fiat Chrysler in 2019 to form Stellantis. This has created a large car company with a mass market focus. There's little in their lineup that goes up against luxury car brands. The focus is on reusing just a handful of platforms to make a profit in the cutthroat mass market sector. There's the occasional foray into the semi-luxury scene like the DS9 to test the waters, but right now Stellantis doesn't have what it takes to compete. And that's been the case for decades. The 2005 C6 was one of a long line of luxury cars from Citroën, and unfortunately their biggest failure. I've made videos about the Citroën CX and the XM, both fascinating cars that charted a different luxury course, and both still have their fervent admirers. There's links to both videos on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.